Okay, so we'll start with the first presentation on co-creating interventions around climate action, climate change 101. So this presentation will cover the basics of what climate change is, why climate change is happening, and how it's impacting people's lives and also places. And we'll also give you a brief overview of the Paris Agreement and whether countries are doing what it takes to address climate change or not. Now, the evidence is overwhelming. Our planet is heating up. We can measure and feel climate warming year on year. For example, based on global averages, 2024 was the warmest year on a record. And so were the last 10 years. They've also been the warmest on record. And it's not just the air that is warming up. Water is warming up too. So most ocean basins reached record warming in 2024. The effects of warming air and water temperatures are felt more around the world. We have heat waves, droughts, storms, intense rainfall, devastating fires. They're made worse and more frequent by climate change. And of course, this comes with dramatic consequences for people's lives. Loss of homes, loss of livelihoods, massive economic damage, and even in most unfortunate cases, loss of life. But let's start with what is climate change and why it is happening. So climate change is defined as the long-term shifts in temperatures and weather patterns. It is largely attributed to the accumulation of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. This accumulation of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere is largely driven by burning of fossil fuels, such as oil, gas, natural gas, and coal. A very significant chunk of carbon emissions actually comes from our energy systems. So despite the discourse around the energy transition, our energy systems are still largely based on fossil fuels. And when burned to produce energy and heat, fossil fuels will release carbon dioxide or CO2 into the atmosphere. Alongside burning fossil fuels, deforestation is another significant source of carbon emissions. So as you probably know, forests normally act as carbon sinks. They absorb more CO2 than they release. But widespread deforestation, where forests are cut down and burned to make space for farmland or land for grazing, removes these carbon sinks, and this results in carbon emissions. A sector that is particularly carbon intensive is the global industrial food system. Deforestation and other land use changes for farmland release carbon. Then livestock releases methane, which is a very powerful greenhouse gas. And the intensive use of synthetic fertilizers releases nitrous oxide. Transportation is another major contributor to global carbon emissions, with road vehicles accounting for the largest part of emissions. Now, CO2, nitrous oxide, and methane are all greenhouse gases, and they act like a blanket that is covering the Earth and traps the heat. So without the effect of greenhouse gases, the Earth would be at an average temperature at around minus 18 degrees Celsius. So we do need greenhouse gases, but too many greenhouse gases thicken this blanket that acts as a heat trapper, and this causes the planet to warm up by much more than it should. Now, when you hear about climate change, you probably hear about cutting down CO2 emissions. CO2 is the main driver of climate change. Why? Because it is the main greenhouse gas that is released when we burn fossil fuels. Now, atmospheric CO2 emissions are most often measured and expressed in parts per million. So in August 2025, atmospheric CO2 emissions were at around 425 parts per million. Now, we started burning fossil fuels and releasing significant amounts of CO2 in the context of the Industrial Revolution. And this is why the Industrial Revolution is used as a benchmark to compare current and past CO2 emissions and global warming. So remember, CO2 concentration in August 2025 was at 425 parts per million. And just before the Industrial Revolution, it was at around 280 parts per million. So this massive increase in CO2 emissions led to global average temperatures being at 1.1 degrees Celsius warmer than they were before the Industrial Revolution. Now, you might think that an increase in average temperatures like 1.5 degrees or 2 doesn't sound like too big of a change, but it is. Basically, the functions of the Earth are broken down into systems. So think about ice sheets, air circulation patterns like the Gulf Stream, the Amazon rainforest, the Great Coral Reef, and so on. And the way these systems evolved is that they function in a very delicate and interconnected balance. And it is in fact this balance that allowed human civilization to flourish over the last 12,000 years. And with raising temperatures, this very intricate balance is at risk to be disrupted with absolutely catastrophic and also irreversible changes. So to give you an example of how much a difference of just a few degrees matters, the average temperature in the last ice age was only 6 degrees Celsius colder than average temperatures today. Now, already we should have done our best to stay within 1.5 degrees Celsius of warming. The difference between 1.5 and 2 degrees of warming may not sound like a lot, but compared to 1.5 degrees, at 2 degrees, species and ecosystems will be at higher risk of extinction. 100 million more urban residents will be exposed to extreme drought. The flood risk will jump from 100% increase in risk to 170% increase in risk. Extreme heat will become 2.6 times worse. Ice-free summers could occur 10 times more frequently at 10 degrees compared to 1.5 degrees, just to give you some examples. Now we know that global temperatures are rising, but how is this warming manifesting? Now we can see direct increases in temperatures, heat waves, but this is not the only consequence. Ice sheets and glaciers are melting. Sea levels are rising. We also mentioned that forests act as carbon sinks, but so do oceans. So oceans absorb around 1/3 of our carbon emissions. But the CO2 absorption doesn't come without consequences. Because of the CO2 absorbed by oceans, oceans become more acidic, which has very serious consequences for marine life. Changing air and ocean temperatures impact circulation patterns. As a result, Europe already sees more frequent heat waves, worsening droughts in the south, heavier rainfall events across all regions. Now, with changing temperatures and precipitation patterns, people will be exposed to rising heat and drought risk, to flooding, forest fires. And importantly, these climate risks threaten critical infrastructure, such as roads, power and sewage systems, even food systems. This impacts people's livelihoods, and unfortunately, in extreme cases, it leads to loss of life. Now, you probably have heard of the Paris Agreement. So the Paris Agreement is a global treaty dedicated to climate change, which was adopted in 2015 in Paris at COP21, so the Conference of Parties. So at COP21, countries came together and agreed to hold global temperature increase to well below 2 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels and pursue efforts to limit it to 1.5 degrees above in pre-industrial levels. Now, almost all the countries in the world have ratified the Paris Agreement, but the US has now left this treaty. The Paris Agreement is legally binding under international law, but the main legally binding provisions are that countries have to submit pledges on their plans basically to reduce carbon emissions. These are referred to as national determined contributions, or NDCs. What they have to do under the Paris Agreement is to submit these NDCs, update them, and to pursue domestic measures to achieve the plans. But countries are not legally bound by the Paris Agreement to cut the emissions to the level which is required to stay within the temperature limits enshrined in the Paris Agreement. The Paris Agreement also doesn't require countries to reduce their emissions by taking specific measures, such as the obvious ones being phasing out fossil fuels or restoring ecosystems that absorb CO2. Now, some progress on climate action can be linked to the Paris Agreement. Almost every country in the world has submitted a nationally determined contribution. Some NDCs are increasing in ambition, and there is a growing focus on climate adaptation and climate finance, although still insufficient. But the Paris Agreement has been clearly no silver bullet. So even if all current national pledges or NDCs are fulfilled, our climate will warm by almost 2 degrees by 2100. And of course, there are implementation gaps. So many countries are lagging behind in terms of what is needed to meet their NDCs. As already mentioned, the Paris Agreement does not provide legal enforcement in case countries don't meet their plans. And as you can imagine, without legal enforcement, it is one thing to design a plan saying that you'll reduce your carbon emissions, and another thing to gather the political will, the funding to adopt laws, policies, and also implement, change the infrastructure, implement the technologies needed to achieve such change. But things might start to change at an international level, and it all started actually with a group of ambitious students in Vanuatu. So in 2019, on the Pacific island of Vanuatu, 27 law students were given an interesting assignment by one of their law professors. So they were told to research the most ambitious legal pathways to address climate change. Now, fast forward to 2023, led by Vanuatu and building on the students' idea, the UN General Assembly decided to ask the International Court of Justice, or the ICJ, to clarify what states' obligations are when it comes to climate action and what are the consequences if those obligations are not met. You might know that Pacific islands such as Vanuatu have contributed very, very little to global carbon emissions. In fact, it's less than 0.01% of global carbon emissions, but are among the most vulnerable countries to its effects because of sea level rise, coastal erosion, and extreme weather events. Now, in July 2025, the ICJ delivered a groundbreaking opinion. It said that international climate law goes beyond the Paris Agreement, so states have an obligation to prevent significant environmental harm and cooperate in good faith to protect the environment. And in fact, these obligations are owed by all states to each other. So it means that this also applies to the US, even though they left the Paris Agreement. The court also said that these pledges that countries submit under the Paris Agreement should represent the highest possible ambition. Of course, each country must act, said the ICJ, but richer and more polluting countries should do more, while poorer countries should do what they can according to their resources. Very importantly, the ICJ framed the right to a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment as really essential to the enjoyment of many other human rights. Now, taken together, these findings by the ICJ will serve to limit the freedom of states to carry on with business as usual So in the future, this means that high emitting countries, such as those subsidizing fossil fuels, could be challenged before the ICJ or in national courts. Now, this advisory opinion is an opinion, so it's not a judgment, but it carries significant authority and will likely see more climate change litigation and more policies that build on it. This is the law standing with the climate vulnerable, but we also see it as a testimony to the power of transformative education. So in schools, in learning centers, in museums, we cannot only teach the world as it is. We must also imagine the world as it should be and explore how to get there. So museums, as you well know, are not just places to preserve the past. They are spaces where people, and especially young people, can come and envision more equitable and more sustainable futures. So exhibitions, programs, conversations can spark new perspectives, international solidarity, and agency in ways that ultimately no policy document can. And this can be truly an act of creative defiance, and we invite you all to partake in it through your work. Now, the next section on climate injustice will cover why climate change is not only a biophysical issue, but a social one too. It will explore how uneven responsibility and vulnerability manifest within climate change. But before that, we'll change gear a bit, and I'll hand over to Anka for a short energizer.
So